Gus, ¿listo?
Adelante, maestro.
Listo. Gus. So, welcome everyone to our second conversation today from our international summit, Asia, a new business opportunity. Today, in this conversation, we're going to talk about U.S. and China relationships and how they impact the world of trade. We want to welcome first Gustavo Garcia from San Mateo University. Gustavo, welcome.
Good afternoon, Sebastian. Good afternoon to our special guest, Paul Craig. And good afternoon to our special attendances. Welcome to this conversation.
Thanks, Gustavo. At the same time, we want to introduce Mr. Emilio Romero. He's the Dean of the Compensatory School from the International Business. Welcome, Emilio.
Buenas tardes. Desde la Fundación Universidad Compensar le damos la bienvenida a este importante evento que ayudará a fortalecer los conocimientos y competencias de nuestros estudiantes de las 3 universidades que nos encontramos hoy reunidas acá. Feliz desarrollo de la actividad. Gracias.
Thanks, Professor Emilio. And finally, from the UBAC University, we have Lydia Flores. Welcome, Lydia, to this second part of our International Summit.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's nice to be here. Muchas gracias por la invitación. Buenas tardes a todos.
Well, thanks very much. So, today we have a specialist with us. It's Paul. Paul has over 25 years experience as an economic and a political strategist. He found View from the Peak in 2011, seeing a need for a truly global multi-asset class research platform that focus on the interactions between public policy, economic trends, technology, and geopolitics. View from the Peak takes its name from the Victory Peak, the highest point on Hong Kong Island, and the firm aims to look the world from 360 degrees, with an Asian perspective. Clients includes endowments, families, offices, government agencies, asset managers, and corporates. The firm has office in Hong Kong, Chicago, and London. Paul, like many China watchers, has been disappointed with tone and substance of the debate regarding the future of the U.S.-China relations over the course of the several years. The need for a more sensible debate forms the genesis behind the U.S. and China series, which seeks to rationally cover these complex issues. So, welcome, Paul, and thanks to be here with us today and to share some point or the point of view that you had from this kind of relations of these two big economies when we talk about Asia and when we talk about international trade.
Sebastian, thank you very much. And everyone, thank you for letting me take a little bit of time to share some thoughts with you today. And it's funny, when you get asked to talk about a topic like China, it's the sort of question where you turn around and say, it's like having a conversation about the United States or about the climate. There are so many different angles that you want to cover, unless you can develop what the the base framework is on how the US economy works, or what's the issues related to climate change, or what actually is China and what is it trying to do, you're unable, I think, to look at issues in greater depth. So you're not going to be able to understand the US-China trade dispute unless you can understand the Communist Party. You're not going to be able to understand why countries around the world are skeptical about having Huawei products in their 5G network unless you understand what is at its core, how the Chinese understand national security and the impacts of events with Japan some 80 odd years, or nearly 90 years ago. So what I'm going to do is, over the course of the next 35 minutes, I'm going to stick very quickly to my watch here, to my phone. And over the course of the next 35 minutes or so, I'm going to talk about 10 topics related to China. And I'm going to stick to 3 to 4 minutes on each of those topics, because I think it's important that if you're going to get a rounded picture on how China views the world, and the mistakes that people make when assessing how China views the world, then and only then can you make correct assumptions about some more specific issues, particularly related to trade. So number one, let me start with the Chinese economy, or the Chinese political economy as a whole. And I want to talk quickly about the size, scale, and misconceptions of China as an economic and political model, right? So this is simple mathematics. China has 4 times the population of the United States, and over the course of the next 8 to 10 years, at current growth trajectories, China will be the largest economy on earth. That is simple mathematics. That's got nothing to do with the United States being predominantly a capitalist economy and China being a hybrid socialist capitalist economy. China has 4 times the population, and eventually it will be a bigger economy. Now, the misconceptions that are made in regards to China, and what the misconceptions around the United States have made towards China, all revolve around the goals of the Chinese Communist Party. Now, if I leave you with one thing today, at its core, the number one goal of the Communist Party is the preservation of the Communist Party. Nothing else matters to Xi Jinping and the powers in Beijing apart from that, because they believe at its core that the Communist Party is going to be the vehicle, the foundation, the essence that drives China to be not the world's most powerful economy per se, but the best economy and the best political structure and the best society that China can be. So in that context, the United States has made 2 fundamental flaws in its assessments of China over the course of the last 40 years, going back to when Deng Xiaoping came to office and started his market reforms in the early 1980s. And those two fundamental errors are, firstly, one, that the United States believed that you could not have economic freedom or economic dominance without political freedom. And the Chinese have proven that you can be a totalitarian state, or a one-party state, a dictatorial state, however you want to describe that, and still have an economic model that has produced some of the most extraordinary economic gains that any economy has seen in human history. More people have been taken out of poverty in China. 800 million plus people have gone out of poverty in China over the course of the last 4 decades, something that's never been repeated anywhere. And that has all been done without the Chinese people having the right to vote on who leads them. Secondly is surrounding the internet. Now, Bill Clinton once said, I think back in 1995 or 96, I think it was, that trying to control the internet was like nailing Jell-O to a wall. And the fact is, the Chinese have been, through its control of the internet, through the Great Firewall, and through its manipulation of the media and the like, has been able to control the internet, or to use Bill Clinton's words, has been able to nail Jell-O to a wall. So this control element that the Communist Party holds so dearly, because it's only with control can the Communist Party continue to make sure that China's path to being the greatest society it can be continues along. And that gets me to my second point, which is a combination of national security issues, but a phrase I'll introduce called the digital Iron Curtain. And the digital Iron Curtain refers to, was actually a phrase was coined by a friend of mine, a woman by the name of Sam Sachs, who is at the Yale Law School. And the phrase refers to China looking very inward in regards to its technologies and its ability to control those technologies, right? So the digital Iron Curtain refers to issues such as the Great Firewall, which is the mechanism that allows China to control the internet. It's very strict regulation in terms of data security. So one of the big issues that that companies face when dealing with China is dealing with data, because data legally cannot leave Chinese shores, because every piece of data, in theory, is viewed under the national security law as something that of vital national security standing. So companies around the world, like I don't if it's JP Morgan or Goldman Sachs or Microsoft or whoever they are, they have to keep all that data that they have in China on servers in China, because China is obsessed with the national security issues surrounding data. It's the reason why Google has no business in China. It's the reason why Facebook doesn't exist in China. It's the reason why it's going to be very, very difficult going forward for companies like Microsoft to continue to have a firm foothold in China, because the trajectory of China to want to have its own indigenous and controllable technology companies dominating every facet of the technology landscape is so important to the Communist Party. And what you've seen over the course of the last decade, and you'll see going out in the future with China's AI ambitions and the like, is that China will continue behind this digital Iron Curtain to continue to grow all its own indigenous technologies to make sure that China continues to be have a strong national security foothold surrounding the most important national security threat that any country faces, and that's regarding its data. I would argue regarding its data security. So, thirdly is the issue of technology regulation. And we've all heard a lot over the course of the last couple of months about, well, really going back to October of last year, when Jack Ma, who's over my shoulder here, had the IPO of Ant Group, which is his financial services company, blocked by Beijing. Now, at the time, that would have been the largest Chinese IPO ever, and it was stopped because many people thought that Jack Ma had overstepped his boundaries, that he was critical of regulators, and that was the reason why China was starting to regulate its technology companies. Now, the reality is that China has been regulating its tech firms in its ever increasing rate. It's really over the course of the last 5 years or so. And there's two very important elements to this. One is that all China is doing at the moment is doing what every other country in the world would like to do, and that's to regulate technology behemoths, and the rest of the world can't do it. The United States, for example, is mired in partisan politics, and whilst there are numerous congressional sessions where Mark Zuckerberg and Tim Cook are pulled in front of Congress to answer dumb questions by politicians, there's been no real legislation to rein these mega companies in. Europe with the EU with its policies regarding, with its consensus politics, where all the 27 member states need to be able to draw a consensus to put through sweeping regulations like around technology. They can't do that, or if it does happen, it takes years to occur. And one of the main things about the Communist Party, because it doesn't answer to anyone apart from the Communist Party, is that stuff like this can get done, right? So when China looks at fintech regulation and sees that Ant Group was making too many risky loans to consumers, or that companies like Alibaba, for example, were forcing customers to buy bundles of goods on its Taobao network and the like, it's very easy for the party to go in there and regulate those segments of the economy. And at its core, the Chinese economy is very heavily regulated. And what you're seeing with this technology regulation is less about trying to rein in billionaires like Jack Ma and more about normalizing regulation to be reflective of other segments of the economy. So the banking sector is heavily regulated, yet the fintech arm of Alibaba was not. Well, to the Communist Party, that doesn't make any sense. To me, that doesn't make any sense. So what we're seeing in China is regulation that is getting more and more aggressive to make sure that the technology space is regulated in the same sort of ways that every other segment of the economy is as well. So let's look at point 4, and I'm going to take a little bit longer with point 4, and this is looking at how Joe Biden views China. So there was an assumption that when Joe Biden replaced Donald Trump, that somehow policy towards China would be softer, that they would be less aggressive than what President Trump was. And the reality is, if you look at the people who are those the policy folks in charge of China, they are probably the most hawkish group of policy people that have existed in any US administration, I would argue, for a very, very long time. And what we're likely to see going forward is a equally aggressive actions by the Biden administration, except the process of getting to those actions is going to be much more process-driven and more systematic than diplomacy by tweet that we had under President Trump. So what we're likely to see going forward, and the problem that the United States has, is that the United States has a policy of holding China back. Right. It's less about how do we build the US up. And I'll get into some examples where the Biden administration is trying to build the United States up. But if you look at policy towards China, be that in the South China Sea, be that in regards to data regulation, be that in regards to semiconductors and the like, the issue is less about how does the US get better and more about how do we hold China back. And whilst there'll be some ways and means where the United States can hold China back, and semiconductors is certainly one of those areas, the reality is that it's going to be difficult for the United States to stop this trajectory that China has, because the Communist Party, being the all-powerful thing that it is, has the ability to regulate the economy, to mandate where spending gets done. And that's why China is the global leader in electric vehicles. That's why China is the global leader in artificial intelligence development. That's why companies like Baidu, for example, have their voice recognition technology is so far ahead of anything that Google and Amazon will do. It's the reason why China, as a financial services model, has the best fintech in the world, right? It's because these companies with government support have been allowed to do this. And unfortunately, Joe Biden's policies towards China as a whole are designed to hold China back economically. Obviously, there are other things that the United States are dealing with, which are more moral stances against what China is doing. And point number 5 is I'm going to points 5 and 6. I'm going to look at some of these areas where the US is trying to hold China back, and also areas where they find things morally difficult. So one of the areas where they're trying to hold back is point number 5, and that's surrounding 5G. Right. So Huawei is by far the best supplier of 5G hardware and software there is anywhere on the right. And what you've seen over the course of the Trump administration, but this is a global issue that has been brewing for many years, is that Huawei now has been viewed by not just the United States, but many countries around the world as a national security threat. And what you've seen is over the course of the last 2 years or so, it's starting in, Australia was one of the first countries to do this, but the United States has a ban on Huawei goods. The Germans now the UK has a ban on Huawei goods. The Germans are going back and forth on whether to do this. Europe has, some areas yes, some areas no. But what is happening is that this paranoia about cybersecurity issues has manifested itself into the fact that the many places in the Western world are not using the best provider of 5G infrastructure to help their countries build out this next generation of 5G, which is so important for artificial intelligence research, autonomous vehicle driving, the Internet of Things, so many different things, right? So the one question I want to leave you with today, and I think it's a vitally important one, is that what is a bigger risk to the United States? What is a bigger risk to the UK and Australia and the like? Is a bigger risk using Huawei products in your 5G network and risking the cybersecurity implications that China can spy on the United States through these 5G networks, which frankly is remarkably difficult. So you can argue the merits of whether they could or they couldn't. Is that a bigger risk, or is it a bigger risk when the United States is going to be, no exaggeration, somewhere between 2 and 3 years behind the China in regards to a 5G rollout? And what's the implications of that in terms of AI research, autonomous driving research, Internet of Things, et cetera, et cetera. So there are consequences for the United States when they look at issues like 5G and thinking, there is a trade-off between the national security implications of a 5G, of having China in a 5G network, and the fact is that most parts of the United States are not going to have decent 5G coverage, probably for several years, if not longer. So point number 6 is some of the moral issues that the United States has over China, and that is regarding Xinjiang and Hong Kong. Now, one of the big things that the world faces will be a trade-off, and the Chinese have drawn a very big line in the sand here, which is a trade-off between, do you want to trade actively and invest in and have investment from us, both trade and investment via Belt and Road initiatives in some cases, right? Or are you going to be critical of the obvious human rights abuses that are going on in Xinjiang, the ripping up of political freedoms in Hong Kong, the human rights abuses in Tibet, and the potential issues regarding any forced renationalization of Taiwan. And unfortunately for the United States, and Donald Trump certainly has left a lasting legacy here, but this is an issue that's gone back arguably for many decades, is that there is, particularly under Trump, there's been an acceleration of loss of moral authority by the United States, not only what it's done internationally in terms of its foreign wars, but certainly issues that we've seen most recently in regards to Black Lives Matter protests and what we saw in terms of the storming of the Capitol building, which by any definition was an attempted coup back in January. So what we're seeing right now is that the Chinese, again, for its own national security issues, but says it's a red line for any foreigner to try to interfere with what we're doing domestically. And it is undeniable that by traditional Western values that there are human rights abuses in Xinjiang. China doesn't see it that way. They have they view the world in a very different moral perspective. But what is going to be very, very clear over time is that countries around the world are going to have to make a decision to either be morally push back against China, but to do so is to risk is to risk things like free trade agreements and to risk investment in infrastructure and the like, particularly amongst Belt and Road countries. And the same issues apply to Hong Kong, because having lived in Hong Kong for 7 years when I was younger, the Chinese have ripped up the agreement, which was the joint declaration that came about post 1997. The Chinese have ripped up that agreement. That is an undeniable undeniable thing to say. And yet the issues regarding Hong Kong, unfortunately, people around the world are going to prioritize economics over these political stances. And for me, I fear for Hong Kong, because it is going to be eventually just a glorified suburb of Shenzhen without the same political freedoms that made it the amazing country that many of us have been to over time. And point 7 is the issue of Taiwan. And I'll combine points 6 and 7 into one, which is Taiwan and semiconductors. Now, when anyone thinks of Taiwan, the first industry they think of is semiconductors. TSMC is one of the great companies around the world and is a huge driver of the Taiwanese economy. But one of the things so Taiwan has two very strategic issues. One is the fact that Beijing thinks that Taiwan is a rogue state, and eventually the goal of the Communist Party is to have Taiwan back as one country within its natural purview. Whether that happens by force, whether it happens organically, that remains to be seen. But it has been and will only accelerate to be one of the great geopolitical issues of the next decade, because it's very difficult for me to see how Xi Jinping leaves office with Taiwan still being under their definition of being a rogue state. The second thing goes back to some of the points I made about holding China back, or the US holding China back. One of the more successful policies that Donald Trump implemented in terms of restricting China, which is manifesting itself globally in terms of a global semiconductor shortage, is the embargo that President Trump put on several Chinese companies, particularly SMIC and Huawei, or their chip arms, HiSilicon, from actually acquiring chips with any US content in that, right? Now, there are two main high-tech fabs around the world, and that's Samsung and TSMC. China does not have the capability currently to produce chips that are smaller than 10 nan. So what does that mean? It means that that as Huawei develops its smartphone technology, it's going to face a massive headwind and potentially a systemic risk, because it's not going to be able to access precision chips that are produced by TSMC or Samsung, because they have US design in those and they are under the embargo. So I think one of the reasons we're seeing this semiconductor shortage at the moment is because of this embargo, and the fact that TSMC cannot sell chips now to many major players in China. Now, and what you're likely to see over the course of the next 5 years is China spending literally hundreds of billions of dollars on trying to develop its own indigenous semiconductor industry. And whilst I don't have any doubt that they'll be able to do that, this is certainly going to take some time to get done. And what you'll find is that there is a distinct chance that many of China's AI efforts, autonomous driving efforts, its technology efforts as a whole are going to be held back over the course of the next several years, because it's just not going to be able to access the chips that it needs to move forward with its AI ambitions and the like. Now, and one of the other things about semiconductors I want to bring up is one of the few things that the United States is doing to try to boost this ideal that states that industrial policy is something that is only done by socialist states, even though we've got 4 decades worth of evidence that says that China can do it really, really well. But one of the things that is proposed right now is a bill called the Chips for America Act. And the Chips for America Act is effectively the first piece of real industrial policy in the United States to happen over the course of the last, I'd say the last 50 years, really since the moon landing in the late 1960s. So what the CHIPS Act is going to do is, over time, will provide roughly now $50 billion worth of subsidies and grants and tax incentives for US companies that produce 10% of global chip output, to bring that back to start doing fabs in the United States. If you believe that semiconductors are the new oil, as many people do, then this is the equivalent of the strategic oil reserves. It is bringing domestic chip production back to the United States to ensure that supply of technology, the infrastructure, the life is produced in the United States. And I think that over the course of the next 4 years, the United States is going to embrace more policies regarding how to boost itself, rather than adopting policies designed purely to hold China back. So the last 2 things I want to talk about are topics where China has true global leadership. Whether or not and how they choose to use that leadership remains to be seen. But 2 areas where I think it is very clear where China, one where they dominate and one where they rule, they can control the agenda. One, they are the dominant global force in regards to fintech. And secondly, and I'll get onto that in my conclusion, is about the climate agenda. So in regards to fintech, through the likes of Jack Ma, through the likes of WeChat, China has developed arguably the best, by far the best digital payment system on the planet. What we have in the United States with Venmo and PayPal and the like is like an abacus compared to what you have with WeChat Pay and Alipay and the like. And what you've seen over the course of the last decade is a simply extraordinary transition from a financial backwater, which was China around the financial crisis, to the global fintech leader. An Ant Group, which was going to go public before the clampdown on the company, was going to be a $300 billion valuation. And just to put that into context, the blockchain/cryptocurrency exchange Coinbase went public today, and that went public at $100 billion valuation. So approximately a third of what the Ant Group is valued at. So what you're likely to see in China going forward is to enhance this. As I said, the greatest digital payment system on the planet is the Chinese are going to adopt what they are calling the digital RMB. And what the digital RMB is not a cryptocurrency, but it is a digital currency, and it is designed to make the digital payment system even more efficient than what it was. Now, there are issues with the digital payment system, and part of those issues revolve around what the People's Bank of China calls controllable anonymity. Now, that is China speak for we can see everything that you do, right? So when you talk about the digital currency, which is remarkably efficient, and we'll talk about its issues of being programmable and the like a little later on. But what the Chinese can do, when you have broad adoption of this digital RMB, the Chinese will be able to see where money is being spent in the economy, how it's being spent, who is spending it. Now, putting the privacy issues to one side, what that does is creates an environment which will allow things like monetary and fiscal policy to be run so much more efficiently than any other economy on earth. So if there's a shortage of liquidity in the real estate sector, well, the PBOC add liquidity there. If there's too much liquidity going into e-commerce or consumer loans, they can tighten policy. They can tighten policy there. And what all this does is, goes back to my original point, which is how does the Communist Party develop the best Chinese economy it can? How does it make it more efficient? How does it make it more secure? Well, having a currency which is fully monitored, that it can be fully monitored and fully controlled, is certainly a way where the Chinese economy can be manipulated. And I was saying to Sebastian before that the Chinese I believe the Chinese have very little interest in the RMB being a rival to the US dollar, because if the renminbi is a global international currency, it means that foreigners have access to sell that currency. And to be a global international currency, you've got to have a deep liquid bond market that's offshore, which means that foreigners can sell your bonds. And as people in Latin America know very, very well, with the numerous Argentine bond defaults and the Mexican the run on Mexican bonds in the 1990s and Brazil's issues in the past, that foreign selling of domestic debt is one of the things that can create a domestic financial crisis. Now, if China keeps its digital RMB internally, if it has a bond market that is very heavily restricted from foreign ownership, it means that issues like financial crises, they're effectively off the table. So it's very hard for an economy to have a financial crisis if it can control its policy so well, particularly through the notion of the digital RMB, which is going to create remarkable efficiencies in that economy. And that's before we talk about currencies being this digital currency being programmable, which it can be. So for example, you can go and pay for go and buy an apartment with digital RMB, and the taxes are automatically taken out, and the broker fees are already automatically taken out, because there's a contract embedded to that digital RMB. These are things that will develop over the course of the next 10, 20, 30 years. And at its core, it's going to create a Chinese economy that is just so efficient. It's now, again, we can talk about the privacy issues and how problematic that is, but in terms of an efficiently run economy, there will be no economy in the world that will be more efficient than the Chinese economy as time goes by. And finally, I want to talk about the one area where I think China wants to provide global leadership, and that is the issue of climate. So recently, Xi Jinping announced that there would be that China would be carbon neutral by the year 2060, and it took the world a little bit by surprise, because we had a peak carbon emission pledge for 2030, but no one was really expecting that China would come out and announce carbon neutrality by 2060. Clearly, that has vaulted China to world leadership, particularly after 4 years of climate denial under President Trump and the US leaving the Paris Accord and the like. And whilst the United States is now back in the Paris Accord, it has former Secretary of State John Kerry is now the climate czar and is looking after the climate agenda. It's clear that the world is very skeptical about US intentions, particularly when you take into account that you could have another climate-denying Republican president in the White House in 4 years' time who could take the United States back out of the Paris Accord, right? So it's understandable why Europe and Asia and certainly Latin America as well is very skeptical about the United States and its intentions on the climate agenda. So that leaves obviously China, which obviously has had its own pollution problems in the past. Frankly, the Communist Party looked at pollution and the climate agenda and realized that that social unrest was likely if Beijing's pollution levels remained as elevated as they were, or if people couldn't drink the water in Shanghai because of toxins in the water. And the Communist Party was very self-serving in this and embraced the climate agenda as a policy to make sure that its own domestic stability was ensured. But I think what you will find over the course of particularly this year and beyond, is that the climate agenda is one place where China is going to lead on the world stage. And in conclusion, we have to be very careful when we look at China and call it a superpower. Now, it's undeniable that the soon-to-be world's biggest economy, with a nuclear arsenal like it is and the reach that it does have, that it does rival politically the United States in many, many forms. But China doesn't want to be the United States. I don't believe it wants the renminbi to take over from the dollar. The Chinese don't want to be the country leading peacekeeping missions in the Middle East, or going to Syria or South Sudan. The Chinese don't want to be a massive naval power outside of the South China Sea because it's trying to just be there to protect its own interests. It doesn't need to be in other parts of the world. And I think that the misconceptions that people make about China are often that they overestimate how globally ambitious China actually is. And I think when you're looking at things like trade policy and the like, I think it's important to realize going to be as important as the military side of things. So when thinking about trade policy, think about what China prioritizes. And that, for me, is the most, if we're going to have effective trade policy around the world, it'll be through a true understanding of what China's intentions actually are. So, Sebastian, I'll pass it over back to you for any questions.
Well, well, thanks very much, Paul. Well, you highlighted most important 10 points that I ever read about China-US policy trade, taking into account something about the internet, topics as the national security, the technology regulation that I think is so important today in many issues. The new politics with the Catherine Tai at the TCR in the US, I think that it's going to take another way that what we saw during the Trump administration, the case of Taiwan, and the leadership in fintech and climate agenda. Only for retake some of these special points that you take. Well, I know that Gustavo has some questions for you. Gustavo?
Thank you, Sebastian, and thank you, Paul, very much for it's an interesting subject, and thank you for sharing your knowledge. As you said, the relationship between China and the Trump administration was very aggressive, yes? And what do you think is the next step that the Biden administration have to take to strengthen the relationship with China?
To improve the relationship with China?
Yeah, indeed, yes.
Gustavo, I don't know if they want to do that. I really don't know if they want to. I think that the one area of cooperation is going to be on climate, right? So that's the one area of cooperation. But if you look at the trajectory of issues like Xinjiang, for example, if you look at issues like, for example, the trajectory of banning Chinese companies from listing on the New York Stock Exchange or NASDAQ, that momentum is growing. There is growing momentum for the United States to boycott the Beijing Winter Olympics next year. There is growing, I often ask this question of politicians when I say, does the United States Congress, or in your case, does Joe Biden want American companies to have big businesses in China? Right? Now, if I was asking that question of President Obama, if I was asking that question of President Bush, if I was asking that question of Bill Clinton, all of them would have said absolutely, right? They're going to say, we want to sell stuff to 1.4 billion people, right? Now, it's much more complicated because the issues of intellectual property protection are much more important. The issues of data security are much more important. it's naive to, it's naive to think that the US doesn't do cyber hacking of other countries, because they do, right? Because everyone at the moment, everyone's trying to hack everybody else, right? But China is very good at this and has been doing this for a very, very long time. So I think that there is, certainly there are plenty of reasons to be skeptical of China, to be worried about China. The human rights abuses are real. They really are. And unfortunately, I don't see a scenario where the United States can do enough to China to force them to change, right? So you'll have issues like what happened with Russian sanctions over Ukraine, where you put sanctions on banks, you put some sanctions on some party officials, but are they going to change? Well, I'd say no. I'd say they're not going to change, and they don't want to change, frankly. So I think that the Biden administration has the problem that it faces is that economically, I think what we need to concede is that the capitalism is the greatest economic model ever invented, but it ain't perfect, right? So maybe what you need to have in the United States like an infrastructure spending program, like it's doing, and that's a positive thing, right? But Joe Biden's issue is, how do you bridge the gap between China and the United States on technology, and how do you make sure that the stuff that the United States does really well, right? Like its military, like its universities, like a lot of its technology companies and the like, that they continue to do very, very well. But I can't see the relationship improving, because China's not going to change and the United States is trying to hold it back.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you.
I know that Professor Lydia Flores from Mexico have a question.
Well, it was kind of related of the last thing that you said. It was about if the war between China and United States is going to end soon. I'm talking about this technology war where they prohibited the use of some software over there in China. I'm talking about China, and it was kind of answered with your last words. So I think for me, it is answered.
Okay. Well, yeah, I have another question. Like, if we've talked about regional integration, yeah, what we see in Asia, we see that China have been to ratify the RCEP, RCEP.
Yep.
And well, by the other way, US was waiting, or what is going to happen with the CTPP. It's the United States is going back in order to gain the share of market, or what we can see about that.
So the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, said last year, before he was in office, before the election, said that leaving TP, he was working with Hillary Clinton, and back in 2016, in 2015, everyone was ready to go into TPP as it was back then, and then the election comes. Donald Trump becomes the candidate, and suddenly Hillary Clinton backs out of TPP, right? And Jake Sullivan said at the time that was a mistake. But I don't think there is a political will in the United States to go back into TPP or CPTPP. I don't think that there is the ambition to do that, because at the end of the day, Sebastian, this doesn't poll well. At the end of the day, the American people don't trust free trade agreements. They don't trust them, and politically, it's going to be very difficult to do. Even though, as Colombia knows as well as any country on earth, the United States benefits from TPP because all these other countries are going to reduce their trade barriers and the like, and the United States was going to be a huge winner in all of this. So I don't think anything happens there. I don't think politically it's something that is wanted, and the reality is that I don't think that it's a priority for Joe Biden, who is going to obviously prioritize COVID, getting over COVID first. Infrastructure is going to be the second thing. And whether or not trade deals are on the agenda, I think remains to be seen. I doubt they will be.
Okay, that's interesting case. Like how it works in Asia with this kind of integration, and how the government of the United States is going to work. It's an interesting point. Well, I have another question here, and it's related about technologies. 1 second. I have here. Well, it's a general question about technologies, about the 5G technologies. Do you think that our countries are ready for the 5G technologies implementation?
Do I think that
that our countries is ready to the implementation for 5G technologies, like the US?
Are they ready? The answer to that question is no. The answer to that question is no, because the number one provider of hardware for 5G is Huawei. They are, yes, you can get it from Ericsson and Nokia. They also produce that 5G technologies. You can get some of it from companies like Cisco Systems and the like, but very few. At the end of the day, Huawei is the best 5G company on the planet. They just do it better than everybody else. They've got the better technology. And the reality is that if the United States is going to rely on Ericsson and Nokia in particular to roll out its 5G network, plus also rely on the private sector to roll it out, it's not going to get done quickly. It's not going to get done in a speedy manner. Now, I'm in Chicago right now. I'm in an inner city suburb of Chicago. My 5G is going to be fine because I'm in a big city, right? So that's eventually going to get here, right? But if I'm in rural America, you're not getting 5G probably for three years plus, because if you don't have Huawei products in there, you're not getting the best stuff. Now, there are countries who are allowing Huawei involvement. Most Asian countries are allowing Huawei's participation, and that's why Korea and China and Singapore and the like have very high 5G penetration rates already. Sebastian, I can't tell you the improvement, the ability to do research on AI in particular, autonomous driving research, right? Yeah, 5G just takes that to a whole new level. So an hour of driving in an autonomous vehicle with 5G will generate a terabyte of data. An hour of driving in an autonomous vehicle is 1 terabyte of data, right? So that is what 25 iPhones worth of data. It's extraordinary, right? But you can't do that without 5G. So how does Google keep up with companies like Baidu and Xiaomi and these companies and Neo and these companies in China if they don't have 5G in the United States? I think it's really problematic. And those countries that have embraced Huawei will have 5G early. Those countries that can't get comfortable with Huawei, well, the consequences are their 5G will be delayed.
Wow, thanks. It's going to be a big challenge for all of our countries talking about this kind of technology. Well, I have another one. Well, if we will look some economic perspective, we can hear that China GDP could overtake US sooner than expected. So what is your point of view about this growing of economy,
so
even though we have COVID?
I think it's going to be somewhere between 8 to 10 years. And there's, as everyone is well aware, there's a lot of skepticism about Chinese data. Right, people are very skeptical about the quality of Chinese data. Where you can be confident that it's going to eventually be a bigger economy is I can be skeptical about the data, but I'm pretty confident about the population. And when GDP growth at its core is how many people, how many workers you have, how hard they work, and how productive they are. That's GDP, right? And if the population of China is 4 times that of the United States, it's not going to take long, and I think it's about 8 to 10 years before it becomes the biggest economy in the world, and more importantly, probably be around a quarter of global GDP. right? So it's currently around 17% of global GDP. I think if China's ambition is to double GDP by 2035, which again, assuming growth rates elsewhere, China will probably be about a quarter of global GDP at that stage, which means that, from a trade perspective, it's going to be everybody's biggest trading partner.
Okay. Here we're waiting for some other questions. Just wait a minute. Okay, I think that we have time for one last question. I don't know if Gustavo or Lydia have any questions so far. Gustavo, Lydia.
No questions, Sebas.
No questions.
We're waiting and we don't have any other question.
So I think that I have another one.
Sorry, Sebastian, I lost this. Yes, I have other question. Mr. Paul, what do you think is the opportunity to South America or Latin America in the current relationship between China and USA?
So the obvious place is commodities, right? The obvious place is commodities. And you saw during 2018 and 2019, right, when the dispute was heaving up, that China needs to buy soybeans, and China needs to buy wheat, and China needs to buy corn because it has a national security need for food stability, right? So China, at the end of the day, needs to buy this stuff from somewhere, right? And you saw things like soybean output in Brazil go crazy, during the trade dispute, because basically what happened was they were directing sales that were going to American farmers over to Brazilian farmers. But look, I think it's so much more than that, because look, at the end of the day, China has food security issues. It has energy security issues. And these are things that Latin America does produce. I mean, obviously, and it's not just iron ore, it's not just soybeans, but I think there will be opportunities. Particularly, I think tourism is going to be a huge thing for Latin America going forward, right? Because, my own country, Australia, benefited tremendously from tourism and education of late. But the relationship with the Australian government and the Chinese government is as toxic as it's ever been. And, I don't think that Australians at the moment are making Chinese, when they can travel, are making Chinese tourists and students welcome in the country, right? That's an opportunity. That's a tourist opportunity for Latin America, right? Now, I get it's still a long way to travel and the like, but the Chinese middle class are affluent. They're keen to travel. They're keen to experience the world. So I think travel and tourism could be a huge industry for Latin America going forward. And I think that, but at its core, it's still going to be addressing the energy and food security needs of China, which a lot of that is around commodities. But like every economy in the world, Latin economies are the same. They want to move up the value chain and produce higher margin goods, and that's going to be a competition globally for China. But look, the Chinese economy, if it's going to be 25% of global GDP by 2030, 2035, that's a big pie. And there's going to be plenty of room for value-added goods from all over the world to be sold to China.
Thanks very much. Well, I have the last question, and I think that is an interesting one. Yeah, we're talking about like the difference we have between the U.S. and China. Yeah, but the U.S., for example, have an important relation, for example, with Colombia. Colombia is an important partner for the U.S. right now. Yep. Yeah, and China, for example, have a good relation with Peru. Yeah. Okay. A close relations with Peru. They have a free trade agreement. Yeah. Do you think that it could be like a world trade between these special partners that they have in the region? For example, China is trying to gain a share market here in Latin America to introduce their politics and so on. So do you think that it could be like a other aspect in the trade war that we can see?
Sebastian, I don't think countries have to choose. And I don't think it's fair, and I don't think it is something that's sustainable for the United States government to say to Colombia, you're our guy, you're our country. We don't want you dealing with China, right? Because if I'm Colombia and I look at the things that you sell to the world, you don't just want one customer. You just don't want the United States. You want to be able to sell to, again, China's going to be a quarter of global GDP in the next probably in the next decade, right? You want to be able to. Every country in Latin America is want to go to sell to China, and what I describe this as is the economic opportunities in the United States are good, but they're not growing like they're growing in China. So I make the argument that the world is embracing a China-first foreign policy, and that foreign policy revolves around economic opportunity. And as I said, there's going to be issues regarding countries turning a blind eye to things like human rights abuses and fair trade practices and the like. But at the end of the day, Colombia owes it to its businesses, it owes it to its citizens to embrace any economic opportunity that comes from China. And frankly, what I think you'll see is the United States' efforts to push back on, be it Colombia or Brazil or wherever, to say to them, we want you to be with us. It's not going to work because countries are going to want to trade aggressively with both countries.
Well, thanks very much for. I think that we finished with our last questions. So I would like to say thanks, Paul, for this special hour, taking some notes about how the U.S. relationships and how the trade diplomatic works at the high level. Yeah,
wonderful.
We talk about very interesting points and different point of views and how it works, and it could be worked during the future. I would like to. I don't know if Lydia have. Yeah, Lydia? No?
Yes.
Okay.
Well,
Okay.
we had one more question. I'm sorry.
Okay.
They just sent it to me.
No
It's because this is very interesting for us because your point of view is different. With Mexico, we are our first partner, commercial partner is the United States, and the second one is China. Well, the third one is China. We have the important ports here, but will you think besides commodities, there is something else that we can take opportunity into trade with China?
Yeah, it's Lydia. So obviously, when the trade dispute happened, right, everyone thought, who's going to be the winner in this? Well, Mexico's going to be the winner of this, right? Because you're going to have all this sort of low to mid-end manufacturing that's going to come back to China, right? And the whole thing in the auto industry is a great example of that, right? Where there was a lot of auto manufacturing and particularly auto parts manufacturing that was done in China because Donald Trump mandated that. What is it? 70? No, the new agreement was 72% of product of a car had to be local, had to be NAFTA sourced and the like. But I think that the opportunity sets. I view what you're seeing with China. Yes, there's going to be intense competition between Chinese manufacturers and Mexican manufacturers for the US consumer, right? That's going to happen, right? But I do look again, just as Colombia is going to have a bilateral relationship with China, so will Mexico, and there are things that Mexico will do very, very well that China won't, and vice versa. And that's the opportunity. And I go back to the point I've made consistently that if China's going to be a quarter of GDP, global GDP, Mexico's got no choice but to trade with China and find the industries that China and the products that China needs, and whether that's finished goods, whether that's moving up the tech, developing its own indigenous tech industries to rival China. Mexico will find a way. It's going to be more than just natural commodities and the like. It'll be sort of manufacturing at a different scale. But if you were to ask me where I think the relationship's heading, I think it's more about Mexico does great as a competitor to China and can compete with China in many, many areas. but there's 800 million urban Chinese that want a lot of the same stuff that you and I want, Lydia, and and they need to get it from somewhere. Why can't Mexico deliver that?
Thank you very much.
I don't know if maybe Gustavo have another question, or I'm not sure.
No, Sebastian, I don't have any more question. Thank you.
Okay, that's perfect. So yeah, so Mr. Paul, I think that we run out of questions. It was very interesting. We're talking about U.S. relationships and your point of view that you've been working for several years, taking another point of view of how this relation works and how can they affect trade policy around the world. So it was a pleasure to have you here with us in this international summit from Colombia and Mexico, from Universidad Compensar, Universidad San Mateo, and Universidad UBAC from Mexico. I know that Cynthia has the close words for this session. Thanks very much, Paul.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of the event.
Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Paul.
Thank you very much, Paul.
Okay. Listo.